Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on Doordarshan, India's national broadcaster, about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and India's involvement in a variety of groupings that help to maintain balance, stability, and prosperity in the world. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking up the evolution of the Quad grouping, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue as it was called, involving India, Japan, United States and Australia, and how the Quad has come to a stage of maturation today, and what are the reasons behind it, and where is the Quad headed. This is the focus of the discussion, and to take us through this journey, I have a special guest. Let me introduce you to her, Gaurie Dwivedi.
Thank you so much for having me.
Gaurie Dwivedi is a senior journalist. She is senior editor at the Economic Times, important national newspaper, and is also the author of a well-known book, Blinkers Off, and how the world will confront China. So, welcome to Indian Diplomacy, Gauriji.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Chaulia.
Gauriji, the Quad was like a twinkle in the eye when the late Shinzo Abe, the leader of Japan, envisaged it way back in 2007. He spoke about a quadrilateral security diamond, and he also talked about an arc of freedom and democracy, combining the potential might of these four countries: Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. From that moment of conception at the ideation level to today, we are talking about a very advanced stage of the Quad, where they have moved from ministerial to summit level diplomacy, and a lot of concrete material projects being implemented on the ground. There is a security dimension, there is an economic dimension, there is even a cultural dimension to what the Quad is trying to do to try and shape the Indo-Pacific. Now, how would you see this journey? I mean, and what do you think are propelling the the rising coherence of the Quad, and they coming together at such a critical moment? How do we understand the evolution of the Quad?
I think even late Shinzo Abe would not have been able to imagine that so fast the journey to the summit level would be achieved as it has in the second phase of Quad, or Quad 2.0 as you would call it, since 2017 when it was revived. But it's been a journey with its fair share of bumps for Quad, I would say. When it started in 2007, it was itself after tsunami. They changed it to have some sort of an broad network for tackling climate change and a few of those areas. But from 2007, in its earlier avatar, Quad did face resistance and hesitation from most of the member countries, and the reason for that was they did not want to upset the growing ties that all these countries had with China, both India as well as Australia.
Yeah, backed out. Yeah,
yes, they did, and which is why it petered out completely in 2008. But in its present form, the revival has been in the last 5-6 years, since 2017, because of now the acceptance of all the four countries at their individual level, at the national level, as well as at a global level, that China is a concern, China is a big threat, and no nation is now in a position, not even America, to tackle that threat individually on their own. They need to have a framework of like-minded countries, which is why Quad is now making the kind of progress it is. And I'm glad that it's also now aiming to address most of the concerns that countries in this region have, Indo-Pacific, not just focus only on a defense level threat that China poses, but on many levels, from maritime to cyber to technology, climate change, and we'll cover all of that in this discussion. But it's very important that it's been able to evolve into becoming that kind of a framework.
And Gauriji, you already mentioned the C factor, and there's no doubt that it's China is the common shared concern, and I think could we argue that the pace and the scope of Quad has grown parallelly to the more menacing avatar of China that we have seen? I mean, especially under President Xi Jinping, they have been on the offensive, and they have been expanding both territorially and also through economic coercion and other means. So it looks like that has been a pivotal factor especially the Xi Jinping era, in suddenly waking everybody up that look, we have to get our act together and we have to, form some coalition. It's not an alliance, it's not really a formal alliance like NATO, even though the Chinese are calling Quad as an Asian NATO and denouncing it. But don't you think that's the fundamental change that's happened? I mean, Xi Jinping coming in and pressing all firing all cylinders, pressing all accelerators, and in return it's one of those Newton's laws of motion, isn't it? For every action there's an opposite reaction. It looks like the region has realized that they need to react to this.
Absolutely. China's wolf warrior diplomacy under Xi Jinping has been one of the key factors in Quad member countries escalating their collective response. You're right, it's not a NATO, it's not a formal grouping, it is just a broad network of countries coming together with a shared concern around China. And China's acts have been on many fronts, whether it is the maritime threats that it poses to the entire Indo-Pacific region, whether it is using its civil coast guard and turning it into almost like a parallel naval outfit to terrorize some of the smaller countries in the region, or it is about taking trade to a completely different level in terms of weaponizing it, what it did against Australia during COVID. All those acts did force these member nations to come up with a collective response, and that response is on multiple levels. And I believe that China's continued aggression is the reason why NATO, why Quad will continue to evolve and continue to find newer ways to tackle the Chinese threat in the region. It has already stepped up on many fronts, from space to cyber, as I said, to several other domains, climate change. It will continue to do so, probably more in technology, because that's a domain that will become even more important as one sees the semiconductor wars that are taking place between India and China. I see technology becoming the backbone of Quad countries going forward.
Yeah, so viewers, what Gaurie Dwivedi is saying is that there is a multi-dimensional challenge posed by China, and therefore Quad naturally also has a multi-dimensional agenda which is being formed. But of course, it's not only limited to China, but certainly that's one of the propelling factors for the Quad becoming stronger. Viewers, the 2023 Quad Summit was held in Hiroshima, Japan. And I'd like you to listen to a few highlights of what the leaders of the four countries mentioned at the Quad Summit, and then continue the discussion. Let's hear them.
Standing together for an open, stable, secure and prosperous Indo-Pacific region. A region where sovereignty is respected and all countries, large and small, benefit from a regional balance that keeps the peace. Respect for the leadership of regional institutions, including ASEAN, the Pacific Island Forum and the Indian Ocean Rim Association, is central to our approach. And our vision statement that we will release tonight sets out the principles for our engagement in the region. Through the Quad's positive, practical agenda, we are taking action to address shared challenges.
साझा प्रयासों से हम फ्री, ओपन और इंक्लूसिव इंडो पैसिफिक के हमारे विजन को प्रैक्टिकल डायमेंशन दे रहे हैं. क्लाइमेट एक्शन, disaster management, strategic technologies, reliable supply chain, health security, maritime security, counter-terrorism जैसे महत्वपूर्ण क्षेत्रों में हमारा सकारात्मक सहयोग बढ़ रहा है.
Without striding together with regional countries, FOIP cannot be attained. We will listen to the voices of regional countries of the ASEAN, South Asia, and Pacific Island states to engage in practical cooperation which delivers true benefits to the region as a force for good.
I think people are going to look back at this, the Quad, and God willing, 10, 20, 30 years from now and say it changed the dynamic not only of the region but the world. And while the setting today is different, in our last 2 years, we made enormous progress, in my view. We're now launching a new initiatives to keep that progress going, from projects to build secure telecommunications in the Pacific region, to strengthen our cooperation in submarine cables, new joint efforts between our private sectors to invest in infrastructure and clean energy projects in the region. And I'm also proud of the work we've done with our partners, the ASEAN and Pacific Islands. Matter of fact, I was with one of our counterparts today at the larger meeting, and he's part of the ASEAN countries, and he said, I think the Quad is a very good idea.
Viewers, so you heard from the leaders talking about the Quad's intent and plans for quote-unquote practical cooperation. Gauriji, the Quad is now, in an advanced stage definitely compared to, the early years we spoke about. And here the emphasis is on the word practical. And they're actually getting down to the ground in this region, and the leaders are talking about the 3 sub-regions of the Indo-Pacific, the Pacific Island nations, the ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries, and then South Asia, the Indian Ocean region. And these 3 they see as one seamless expanse where they need to act together. And all these initiatives President Biden was talking about, for example, these are now being implemented in phases, and we are going to see something very concrete on the ground. For example, one of the agreements at the Hiroshima summit was to build open access radio networks which will help with telecommunications and also undersea cables for internet connectivity in the region. Now these are fundamental building blocks, what we call digital infrastructure and all that, apart from the physical infrastructure. And this is where I think there's also a security dimension. The smaller countries can easily be penetrated and spied upon by adversaries or by great powers. So I think the Quad is seen what is actually strategically important in the region, what is economically important, and we are trying to put our money where the mouth is. And so your thoughts on this practical cooperation dimension and also the sub-regions, the 3 sub-regions. And one of the things I noticed was that there's more of an emphasis now on Indian Ocean and South Asia also. Earlier it was limited mostly to Pacific islands and ASEAN. But now I think India, because we are very keen that they should also come to our backyard and do things together with us. So all the 3 sub-regions and the practical cooperation, how do you see this going?
I think that has been a big change in terms of perspective of all the 4 countries. Till now, there wasn't that much of a realignment in terms of strategic priorities in the entire Indian Ocean region. For India, of course, our Indian Ocean was the most important in the Indo-Pacific. For Australia, it was the Pacific Island region which was very important, which is why the whole Solomon Islands issue has been such a big concern for Australia, rightfully so. For Japan as well as for America, the East Asia region has been very important. So now there is a meeting of minds amongst the 4 member nations that the entire Indo-Pacific needs to be seen in its entirety. We cannot block it into parts or subparts, because Chinese threat exists from Seychelles all the way till Solomon Islands. We need to be cognizant of the Chinese threat in the entire region and some of the other challenges in the region that are coming up, whether it's climate change or disaster recovery or even health for that matter.
Yes.
And I think health is a phenomenal change that the Quad has now woken up to. It has revamped the vaccine program that it had earlier into a larger health issue and a larger health program, which is very important because there will be new viruses that will come up and countries will need assistance in terms of their response. And some of these smaller countries, which are anyways significantly impacted by climate change and some of the other aspects, will need that kind of a hand-holding for health. So that's a major achievement that Quad has done. But as far as the region itself is concerned, it's very important that there is now complete clarity and alignment amongst the 4 member nations. The Indo-Pacific exists as a single large maritime domain that cannot be broken into parts. As far as the practical aspect, as I said, health is one aspect. The other important area that you mentioned, which was the undersea cable region, this is in response to the digital BRI. The Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese President Xi Jinping, the single biggest component or the most ambitious component of it is the digital BRI, which connects about 60 odd countries through these undersea cables. And the utopian idea is, or the most perfect idea is, that there should be seamless exchange of information amongst these countries. Obviously, with Chinese contractors having access to that
will
information.
have the back door, yeah.
Exactly. And that raises serious concerns because you're talking about financial information, personal information, who knows, submarine data. It could be any and all of it. And in response to that, it is very important to have safe and secure lines of undersea cables for communication. So I think that's a very important response to digital BRI that China is very actively investing in.
And Gauriji, maritime security is unavoidable because Indo-Pacific is a littoral region, and here, you know, the territorial disputes and the claims that China has been making, we know it very well. There is this aggressive push in the Xi Jinping era to impose their claims and to unilaterally change the status quo. Quad leaders have said that we oppose actions that lead to unilateral changes in the status quo or to attempt to redraw borders using muscle power. So rules-based order, essentially that's what we are saying, abide by the UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, abide by, you know, civilized conduct, and if not, there are other means by which we can push back. I mean, that seems to be the signal. So while Quad itself is not a military alliance, there is a parallel, you know, the Malabar naval exercises and other forms of maritime, you know, naval defense diplomacy that we are doing. So there, you know, there could be crisis in the region. And do you think Quad is prepared for crises? I mean, one big question is always Taiwan. Could the Chinese go for, you know, an all-out war? Could the, you know, could they do the same by occupying more territories in the South China Sea, more encroachment in the Indian Ocean region? So you think on defense also Quad parallelly has been making progress. So you think they are prepared for crisis?
I think Quad's biggest test is yet to come. Whether it is going to be Taiwan remains to be seen. But I think defense preparedness of Quad rests on the defense preparedness of the four countries and their bilateral relations with each other. Take for instance Japan. The changes it has made in its pacifist nature and the increase in its defense budgets will make it the third largest country in terms of defense budgets in the next couple of years.
Yes.
That intent, if it is met with the similar response by the other three countries, will make the Quad strong. It will make the defense preparedness of the Quad that much stronger. But to have a collective defense response would probably undermine its potential, because then it will give China the response and what it has been saying all along, that we've always called it an Asian NATO, and the four countries have proven it to be right. So to that extent, the defense preparedness has to be more of a national response to the region's challenges rather than a collective response. However, some of the changes that I mentioned, Japan being one, and the ability to now host some of those missiles that Japan has now taken a decision on, will have a very large bearing on the defense framework of Quad going forward. Likewise for Australia, the AUKUS is a response to that. But again, that's not Quad's response. That is the country's individual response, which will just make Quad that much stronger.
Interesting. So Gaurie Dwivedi says, viewers, that not all four together, you know, can actually engage in joint operations yet. But who knows? I mean, the circumstances and the kind of Chinese conduct that we are seeing, if it reaches a certain point, then you can't rule out even formal alliances coming into place. But for now, we are doing these variable geometry, as we call it in diplomacy. Bilaterals, viewers, we already spoke about bilaterals and the importance of bilaterals within Quad. And one of the most exciting and the fastest growing one is Australia and India, which are in many ways the main pillars now to take the Quad agenda to a much faster and higher level. Viewers, I have an interesting comment from Natasha Bhaskar. She's executive director of Newland Global, a consultancy based in Sydney, Australia, about Australia-India partnership and how it is crucial driving force to take Quad forward. Let's hear her and continue the discussion.
Among Quad nations, India needs investment, attractive financing for its infrastructure goals, technology and access to key raw materials, particularly critical minerals and rare earth elements. The other Quad members are looking for market access and reliable destinations for investment. So boosting economic ties under the aegis of the Quad partnership would make a win-win situation for all the countries involved. This is also very well aligned at the bilateral level. Australia and India's comprehensive strategic partnership is reinforced by a range of practical initiatives to expand trade and investment. Cooperation in defense, maritime safety and security, cybersecurity, critical minerals, water resources, skills and governance, geoscience, space, and workforce mobility. The signing of the interim trade deal, the Australia-India Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, is India's first trade deal with a developed economy in a decade and its second trade deal in a span of 11 years. That promises to push bilateral trade of goods and services from the current $27.5 billion to $45 billion by 2030. So both countries have also launched the Australia-India Infrastructure Forum to promote two-way investment in infrastructure and support broader trade and investment bilateral objectives, low emissions technology partnership, critical minerals partnership. So there's a clear focus to further enhance the Quad objectives through the bilateral agenda. The focus is to address vulnerabilities, manage disruptions, and reduce concentration, build in more supply chain resilience, led by collective peace and stability as well as collective economic gains. What it categorically asks for is the four Quad members must also be flexible and prepare for fast-moving global developments. That calls for seamless collaboration among them.
Viewers, Natasha Bhaskar from Sydney telling us that the Australia-India is motoring, the Australia-India partnership is motoring the Quad forward with a lot of important strategic bilateral collaborations. Gauriji, Australia-India has been one of the fastest growing, as we have been saying, and initially it was Japan-India, but now we say it's Australia-India. But if you look at India's major bilateral dyads within Quad, we are pretty strong with all three, and we have 2+2 dialogues, yes, foreign and defense ministers with all three. Yes. We have pretty much comprehensive, special, global, you can call it whatever strategic, you want to call it, all kinds of strategic partnerships happening bilaterally, and we are working on those. And I think the confidence that we get from the bilateral then transfers to the Quad, isn't it? And I think there's hardly an area where there's disagreement. I mean, initially people used to look for, the critics used to look for which is the weak link in Quad, Yes. Are the Australians hesitant? Are the Indians hesitant? Are the Americans, can they be relied upon? Will they commit to the Pacific or will they run away when it comes to confronting China? There are all these yes, speculation as to which is the weak link. But lately, if you see the kind of commitment all are making, it just suggests that there is no longer a need to dwell on the weak link theories, but rather to focus on the bilaterals and strengthening them, like you said, and which then gives impetus for the quadrilateral.
Yes, indeed. And I agree with Natasha on terms of the economic partnerships that are being forged, though I feel that there is still a lot of room for improvement and going ahead. I mean, if you just take the Australia-India trade, it's $34 billion and it's expected to become $50 billion by 2026-27. So yes, there is still a lot of room for improvement. The trade pact that has been signed is definitely a huge step forward. And let me just point out one thing in terms of how the trade pact between India and Australia has a direct bearing on the role that India now plays in terms of Quad. And I'll tell you why. The trade pact is supposed to be, or is perceived to be, in favor of India. Some of the most important exports of Australia, which is dairy, walnuts, have been excluded because of India's concerns around its farmers. And the reason for it to be excluded and still getting signed in such a short time is because Australia wanted to be on India's side. And that shows the kind of importance that Australia-India economic ties have and their larger bearing on Quad as a whole, and India's role in stitching this alliance or this informal alliance even further. And I think that is really the biggest subtext, so to say, as far as the bilaterals shaping the Quad's future. So India, Australia definitely will have a larger bearing in terms of Quad's future from here on.
And Gauriji, last word, we're running out of time. There is this talk of Quad Plus and the expansion of Quad. During the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, Quad also invited Vietnam and South Korea and New Zealand to join hands in joint initiatives for public health. So, but of course, some countries in the region are reluctant to directly join Quad because of the fear of retaliation from China. But I think as the group gets stronger and more coherent and more present and visible on the ground, informally at least, I would expect that Quad Plus should be operational, because ultimately that's the way to, like we said, to maintain balance in the region. Because if you are up for a challenge against an expansionist China, you need all hands on deck.
Quad Plus will come up the day Quad has a response in terms of infrastructure investments to BRI. There's a lot of commitment on that front, that infrastructure investments and the whole Quad investor network, the day it starts reflecting on ground, ASEAN will certainly tilt firmly towards Quad, and the Quad Plus will start taking shape. Whether it's Vietnam, Indonesia, Cambodia, Laos, all these countries are in direct line of fire when it comes to China. And they're also recipients of large infrastructure investments through BRI. For them to steer away from China or to step back will require the Quad to step up in their infrastructure investments.
Absolutely. So viewers, the point is that Quad has made enormous progress, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And one thing that can be said is that a lot of countries in the region who are not formally part of Quad are announcing their own Indo-Pacific outlooks. Even Bangladesh has announced its own Indo-Pacific outlook. South Korea has announced its Indo-Pacific outlook. Indonesia has announced it. ASEAN as a whole has announced an Indo-Pacific outlook. So we can be quietly confident that, as Gaurie Dwivedi says, as the infrastructure and economic alternatives that Quad or Quad Plus provide, then more countries will come in and want to be part of this initiative for pragmatic benefits. If they join the BRI of China, why can't they join the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, which includes all the Quad members, for example? So I think exciting times ahead for Indo-Pacific. It's a dangerous moment, of course. There could be war, and we can't rule out armed conflicts, but there are also these cooperative mechanisms, regional architecture as we called it, that is being built, and it's worth following and supporting. Thank you, viewers. Thank you, Gaurie Dwivedi. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing insights.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Chaulia.
Let's follow the Quad viewers and the Quad Plus. I think this is an exciting time, as I said, and this is the future that will, as President Biden was saying, it's not just going to define this region, but define the future of the international order and world politics. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.